for joining the Google Hangout. I'm delighted we have a chance to get together. We're at the start now of the most important year of sustainable development that we're going to have for a long time, because we are already in the midst of preparing for three big events this year. In September, the world's governments, the 193 United Nations, are going to adopt sustainable development goals. Works Right will be the guiding principles on sustainable development for the next generation, for your generation. And so these are now in advanced negotiation. 17 priority areas have been identified for sustainable development. I hope the number will come down to a little bit more manageable number of 10 to 12 goals in the end. But in any event, September will be the time to adopt the Sustainable Development Goals. 2 months before that, in Ethiopia, the world's governments, the 193 UN member states, will convene a conference on financing for sustainable development. How do we make savings in the world flow properly in sustainable technology like low carbon energy, or to high priority like investments in education and in healthcare? Be the purpose of. And 2 months after the September Sustainable Development Goals Summit will be the climate negotiations in Paris at COP21, the Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. This will be the 21st such conference, the first one having taken place in Berlin in 1995, and once per year since then. So this is a very big, because for many, many years, the attention has directed towards achieving a new, substantive, bold climate agreement in December. So all of this means that we have a this year, which, if successful, will define a new direction in sustainable development. If unsuccessful, be a bit of a calamity, because this is really the only year we're going to have for a very long time where the issues of sustainable development as a concept, financing for sustainable development, and climate change are all simultaneously on the agenda. So thank you for taking part in the online course. Thank you for mastering this subject. I'm very happy to tell you that the book, The Age of Sustainable, which are this coming week, it should be available in bookstores. I hope you will find it to be useful for you. It's being published by Columbia University Press. And I must say, they've done an absolutely magnificent job making a really beautiful book with the wonderful color graphics and pictures, and a very vivid way to see sustainable development. So I hope you will be able to get a copy, take a look, share it with friends, and find it helpful in this critical period. Thank you for sending in. Let me start taking some of those questions now. There's a question by Jim Hartsfeld. Let me take it. It says, it seems that technology presents it all was a primary catalyst for the acceleration of economic development. It appears to be creating some of the biggest future barriers through its damage to ecosystems. How do you resolve? This is really a good question, because technology is the most basic source of human progress. the fact that we have better and better tools for energy, for healthcare, for education, for communications, for transportation, food production, many other areas. This is what has been the basic driver of long-term economic growth, rising living standards, and rising life expectancy. But we've also learned through the ages that technological advance carries risks, and often risks that are not foreseen at the start of these technologies. When James Watt developed the steam engine in 1776, I can assure you the last thing on his mind was that his invention was going to change the global climate in a dangerous way. Of course, the whole chemistry and physics of and producing carbon dioxide emissions, and those emissions going into the atmosphere and trapping heat and creating the greenhouse effect was not known. It would be another approximately 125 years after Watt's discovery before that basic science was in place. And it was decades even after that, only the most recent decades, where the world can understand that the scale of coal is now endangering the climate. I think we can see that with almost any technology we have, it can be put to good use, or it can actually become a greater danger. Nuclear energy can provide a safe, low carbon electricity, but nuclear energy can also be the basis for producing nuclear weapons and for terrorism and for nuclear proliferation. Information technology can be the basis for wonderful advances in the ability to have worldwide access to education and healthcare and finance, banking, knowledge transmission. But we know that information technology can also be the basis for spying, for cyber warfare, the surveillance state, for directing drone, many other things. The basis for advances in using effective technologies like carbon capture and sequestration. Geology can also be effective in finding more fossil fuels that accelerate climate change. So the question, Jim, is a very general one. Technology advance by itself is not a sufficient answer to sustainable development. I would say two things are necessary. One is that the technology be directed towards sustainable technologies and away from unsustainable technologies. We direct our discovery efforts, our development efforts, our investments away from dangerous fossil fuels towards safe or safer renewables. That's number one. Second, we need to believe not only naively that technology will save us, but that we have to make which technology. How do we direct it towards sustainable purposes, not their military or unsustainable purposes? And that's a matter of knowledge. It's a matter of moral framework, and it's also a matter of politics. And so I think we can say fairly that sustainable technology is a necessary component of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, but it is not a sufficient component for that. Let's take a question from Adam Ismail. I live in Somalia, where over civil war has destroyed all state institutions. This has resulted in the private sector to grow and thrive, huge informal economy. How do you balance the public sectors in a post-conflict What a pertinent and important question Adam is asking. Somalia has been, I've said, a failed state at least for the last 24 years, since civil war ensued in the early 1990s. It's created a lot of tragedy, a lot of suffering. When drought has hit Somalia, a very dry and drought-prone Horn of Africa, it's led to massive floods. There are big refugee camps. Somalis, for example, in Dadaab, across the border from Somalia, in northeast Kenya. So Somalia suffered a lot. But what has been interesting also is what Adam's pointing out. As the state disappeared in almost anarchic situation for a period of time in Somalia, the private sector has actually, and Somalia became famous for extremely low cost mobile phone coverage, for example. There was almost no regulations, so phone companies or phone providers were able to come in, put up their masts, establish mobile connectivity, very, very competitive. And it shows that opening up a war-torn, conflict-ridden country like Somalia can generate business. But of course, we should never lose sight of the fact that a healthy economy is both public and private economies, what we call the mixed economy. And that's because certain parts of the economy require a strong to build roads and to have effective ports, to have a healthcare system that is able to be accessible by all people, to have a functional system. It's, I would say, not possible to do unless there is a strong functioning public sector. So the private side, a lot of business, and some of that business surprising, like the mobile business or mobile banking activities where people didn't imagine it could come to war-torn places, but now with information technology it can. But I would say that if we really all children have access to vaccines and to primary health care, if we expect to learn, we're going to have to have a functioning state sector. And a country like Somalia, which has been war-torn, or Yemen, or South Sudan, or many other countries, is going to need to find a political formula. The major competing tribes and factions in the country find their place in that political system. It won't look like UK or US electoral system. It's going to and it's going to have to meet the local needs. But that will be the basis for a return to the provision of public services. Now, Okagu Uchenna, of the continents of the world reviewed so far in your lectures, Africa has suffered the most historical deprivations from European and American slave merchants and colonial imperialists. Apart from development assistance, does the West not owe Africa much more reparations? I think first and most importantly, the West and the world owes Africa an apology for past historical injustices and good, reliable, dignified, mutual relations. And this, I think, is the most important for Africa to be able to fully achieve development during this coming Sustainable Development Goal period. Go to the African year in Addis I think hunger can lead to many a hunger union as part of that, and I think that's a very important idea. Why union? Because for Africa to develop, it needs strong trade within the continent. It needs new continental scale infrastructure, power systems, road systems, fiber optic systems, and so on. Of course, it needs to end the cycles of war and violence that have beset so many regions, say the West African countries of Liberia, Sierra Leone, and so forth, which are suffering from Ebola right now, or the Great Lakes region conflicts, or conflicts in the Sahel. I think also it's very important for the outside powers not to turn Africa into more proxy wars. The mobilization in Libya, the paramilitaries in West Africa, the horrendous slaughter from Boko Haram. All of this is a tragedy, but a risk of even spreading violence and war. And the Western countries sometimes see parts of Africa just as war zones, not as people zones. And we should emphasizing a way to move forward peacefully rather than simply scaling up the military operations in very fragile and vulnerable countries. I believe that see sustained economic progress in the coming 15 Sustainable Development Goals. I think that's extremely important. And I hope that the West does not meddle and destabilize countries. You know, it's not only the slave trade, it's not only the imperial rule in Africa. Even after the imperial rule ended, how many the United States or other governments overthrew African governments like Lumumba in the Congo, where CIA played a role in his assassination, or overthrowing other governments that America or UK or France didn't. This, I think, has been a source of destabilization that has also held Africa back. And what we need is mutually respectful relations across countries, peaceful relations, and a focus on development rather than war. This is a question that's on everybody's mind and much debated. It's a core question for our course. Is an environmentally and socially sustainable world possible in a capitalist political economy? Well, this is a subject worth a book, not answer. But I think that one can say the answer is yes, it's possible sustainable development in a capitalist order, but no, it's not easy and it's far from automatic. So we have to define capitalism and then understand that capitalism has many forms, and at least some of those forms with sustainable development, while many others are not. At an economic institutional level, capital means a market economy in which the means of production of both physical and human capital are privately owned rather than government owned, and in which the main director of resources is the market economy, including international trade. Now, even in a capital, and going back to the beginnings of modernism at the entry, all thinkers and philosophers have understood capitalism requires both the markets but also government. And there's been a lot of debate about the relative magnitudes of and size and responsibility of market versus state. But a capitalist system doesn't mean a pure market economy like you might read about an introductory economics textbook. It means more complex society in which markets drive movement of most resources, but governments play a major role in income redistribution, in regulation, in taxation, in public spending, and in the economy from a point of view of the shared will of the population, at least in theory. So that's one way to define capitalism in an institutional way. There is another way that I think is also relevant, which is that capitalism taps into greed and self-interest, and it says to those who want to be rich, you have the motivation and freedom of action to go rich, but to do so in a way which to create new jobs, new industry, new technology, benefit the world. This is the paradox that Adam Smith wrote about when he used invisible, that somehow the self-interest tools, even their greed, could lead to the beneficial effect for society as a whole through a kind of invisible hand. Of course, he meant the market forces of supply and demand. Now, greed has its benefits in a strange kind of way, because it unleashes a lot of energy of people who are very, very hard to try to get rich. And if they develop good products, good companies as a result, there's general benefit. But greed also, of course, has a downside. It can lead to fraud, to illegality, to short-termism, to environmental destruction, to violence, to deceit. It's felt that capitalism can't work simply by saying we unleash self-interest and greed if it doesn't keep that self-interest and greed within a even broader moral framework, which says that the economy as a whole has to meet the needs of humanity. That's why I like sustainable development as a framework in which greed is given some space, but so too is altruism, so too is care for the common good, so too is the thinking. Now, capitalism in practice, not in theory, but in practice, has many different forms. The form that I like is the form of capitalism called democracy, but Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. For the last almost 100 years, social democratic philosophy has said we want capitalism, but we want it to be held in check on hand. We want to ensure equality within our society. We want to ensure the access to public services, to fairness, to justice, and we don't want this is running the show. So that's Scandinavian social democracy. States has a different kind of political system. We would say right wing. I sometimes call it corporatocracy. It's corporations that run the politics rather than the broad public. Because in the United States, political interests, power is really a voice in the role of government. And our big corporate lobbies are the oil industry, Wall Street, the private health care industry, and the military industry, especially military. So that's a different kind of, it's a lot of, but it's not really held in check by democracy or by a moral framework, because the vested interests, these powerful corporate interests have too much of a say because they spend billions of dollars on lobbying, and they spend billions of dollars on paying for the political campaigns of politicians that they expect to their bidding afterwards in writing legislation. So capitalism really fails if the business sector effectively controls the government, because in that case there is or the narrow vested interest. So my answer is a sustainable framework within which can exist, but the overarching framework should be sustainable development. And we should be looking to a political and moral frameworks like social democracy as the best hope of achieving sustainable development. So let me take the next question from Capitalism. What can you do to support the transition from MDGs, SDGs, and the implementation of the sustainable? Young person right now, say 15 years old, when the SDGs are completed, you're going to be about 30 in the year 2030. And that means you're going to be professionals that are going to be helping in this final stretch of achieving the sustainable development goals. In other words, today's youth, of course, are tomorrow's leaders, and it's going to come very, very quickly. So I would encourage youth around the world to form youth sustainable development networks, get students organized at your schools across your country, and then make contact with the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network. We'll help you to put young people in touch with universities and with government officials so that youth can have a stronger voice at the table and also can learn skills of sustainable development. So I would like young people to enroll for my course, The Age of Sustainable Development, become experts in these fields, take the other courses that are now online at sdsn.edu, which include courses on ecology, and there will be courses on public health, on education, and on many other sustainable development sectors. And then I hope that you would participate in local and national brainstorming about the Sustainable Development Solutions Network that I direct on behalf of you, Ban Ki-moon, will be helping to host in many parts of the world SDG orientation sessions this fall, or SDG sensitization sessions, where stakeholders from all sectors, politicians, business sector, academia, and civil society will come together and say, what do the new SDGs mean for our country? And we're going to try to organize several such meetings in the spring, summer, and I would like young people to be involved in that. Young people can get engaged in organizing. Let us know at the SDSN, and we'll try to help make sure that you are connected to the national chapters of the SDSN so that the youth can play an important role in these upcoming deliberations. We have a question from Wilfred Osula. Hello, Professor. Thank you for the opportunity. Do you see China's current investment program in Africa as that of a new colonizer, an exploiter, a partner in economic, or as a new development paradigm toward? On the whole, I see China's role as a important investor and development partner, not as a new colonizer. Colonial power comes from power. the imperial powers were not exercising their influence just through commercial means. They had soldiers on the ground. They were preventing self-government in Africa. China's doing nothing of the sort, and I think it has no interest or intention or history of doing anything of the sort. It is operating in two ways in Africa. Businesses making business deals, trying to gain access to natural resources or to build new markets. And second, the Chinese government making available financing for large-scale infrastructure projects, for roads, for power plants, for electric dams, and so on. I think both activities are very promising for Africa. So the new way for Africa to develop infrastructure and to build commerce. Of course, in any such relationship, whether it's commercial or whether it's diplomatic, Africa needs to defend its interests, make sure that in any bargain, the benefits are shared between the parties. Many companies are operating, it's not always the case for any American or European, that they're not polluting the local environment and that they're not bribing government officials. We need government officials that are taking decisions on the basis of the interest of the country, not on the basis of receiving bribes or secret handouts or invitations to put money in havens. I think that all of China and Africa, because Africa can provide a lot of the primary commodities that China will need for the coming generation. China can provide a lot of the technology. China is wonderful at building infrastructure because it has just built tens of thousands of kilometers of highway and rail and fiber and power grid in its own country. So it's very good at low-cost provision and this is something that Africa very, very much needs. Here's a very interesting, another complicated from Julia Hudson. Professor, how do you see the current use of patent laws and global trade agreements affecting the spread of access to health, education, renewable energy technology, and so on? Oh, you don't ask easy questions. They're all excellent questions. The patent law question is a very and complicated one. What is a patent? A patent, new technology to file for intellectual property protection of that invention. And from 20 years from the date of filing, if the patent is approved by the government, to have the exclusive rights to use that owner of the patent, in effect, has a monopoly privilege. That monopoly privilege that the inventor can keep the price high of its commodity, charge a lot of money for it, and thereby make large. Well, why would agree to give a monopoly to any private company? The end, in the case of patents, to create an incentive to put in the money and time for research and development to make that invention in the first place. So the patent is supposed to be an incentive for innovation, but it's an incentive with the downside. It may create the incentive for innovation, but then because of the monopoly privilege, it also limits the spread of the technology during the 20-year period. So the patents are what is called in economics a second best policy, meaning it doesn't achieve all of its goals. It's not perfect. It's for innovation, but at the cost of monopoly. And to poor countries, if the monopoly owner simply charges a monopoly price, then poor people won't even be able to use the technology at all. And if the new technology is a medicine, for example, or a new vaccine, what would happen is that the price would be so high that poor people would simply die rather than gaining access to this new medicine or vaccine if it's a life threat. What was happening in the case of the AIDS medicines. Now, this means that one needs solutions to make sure that the patents do the good things but not the bad things. And there are two kinds of solutions. One is what's called inventing. The inventor gets the patents in the rich, like the United States, but in the poor markets makes the product available at low cost or lets other generic producers produce the same product through a licensing arrangement. In the end of the day, that's how the AIDS drug crisis was addressed. That the inventors of the new AIDS drugs, the antiretrovirals, which are a kind of miracle drug after all, would charge a high price in the US and Europe, but then license those drugs to low-cost producers in poor countries, enabling access to the same medicines at maybe a 30th or even 100th of the same cost. In the US, AIDS regimen costs about $10,000. It's only $100 a year. The real cost of producing the drugs is only $100. The $10,000 price. We have a new case like this in the United States, which I've recently read out, a drug to cure hepatitis C, which is a killer disease. And the drug is called sofosbuvir, and its trade name is Somalia. And it's produced by a US company, Gilead's the patent for it. It costs this drug $1 per pill. But in the United States, the company is charging $1,000 per pill. It's charging almost $100,000 for the course of treatment, whereas the actual cost might be $100 or $200. So this is where patents show their negative side. They give incentives, but they can also even block the effective use of the products. So I mentioned one solution is segmented markets. A second solution, government rather than the private sector should invest in the research and development. And when government funding then helps to make breakthrough, then that breakthrough is available without patent protection because it's been the public sector rather than a private company that has made the price of, made the breakthrough. Also to prevent the monopoly power from being excessive. In general, because the US and also Europe, but especially the US, developed so many new products, the US government has taken the view that patent protection should be very strong everywhere in the world. But this has not solved the problem of access of poor people to these very inventions. And so we need a fairer system, whether it's segmented markets, more public financing, better regulation, special funds for technology. There are so many possibilities to recognize, can't just rely on markets and patents because that gives too much power. Let me take one more question and really thank everybody for participating today. We're going to do another Google Hangout soon in the next 2 or 3 weeks, and I'd ask you to participate. Let your friends know. You don't have to be in the course, The Age of Sustainable Development, to participate in a Google Hangout. And I think the questions are really excellent, and I want to have more sessions so that we have more time to discuss these questions. So let me take a final question today. We'll send out a notice of the next session very soon. So Wendy asked the question, many people still see sustainability, including climate change, as exaggerated by scientists or something to deal with in the distant future. How can we make this critical more front center for all to the question? Good question, Wendy. Now, there was a recent opinion in the United States carried out by the Research Center that Pew is P-E-W. And if you go online, Pew Climate Survey, I'm sure you'll find it. It was a recent survey of public opinion in the United States about climate change. It was very interesting. It showed that about 2/3 of Americans, 2/3, that's a big majority, say we need to do a lot more on climate change. We need to vote for a candidate that supports action on climate change than one that opposes. So that was all good news from my point of view. And yet the US political system is not providing action on climate change. What's the problem? The problem in the US corporate sector, and especially the big oil industry, does not want action. And they spend a lot of money lobbying their representatives in Washington, and they spend a lot of money giving campaign support to anti-climate change politicians. We have two Koch brothers, K-O-C-H, David and Charles Koch. They are multi-billionaires. In fact, their combined net worth is maybe $100 billion, if you can imagine. And they're spending a huge amount of money to elect right-wing to avoid the age. And they're really too much success. It's paying for tens of thousands of political advertisements that then are having an effect swaying elections. What does this mean, Wendy? It means that the issue is actually already front and center for a lot of people, but maybe their voice is not powerful enough right now. Why do I think it's front center? Well, if you look at the number of natural disasters hitting the world, whether it's the big drought in Sao Paulo, Brazil, or the big drought in California right now, or the big drought, water crisis in Egypt, all already feeling the impacts of unsustainability. And that's why also I think around the world people see this as a serious problem. They want governments to act, but governments are often just in the hands of very powerful financial interests. And so we, the people, need to raise our voices. That's one of the purposes of the course, The Age of Sustainable Development. It's the reason why I wrote a book, The Age of Sustainable Development. I want citizens to be well-informed, to be activists, to demand of their governments. We don't want governments of special interests, of general interest, of public interest, of human species interest, because we don't want to destroy other species also. And so we need to be organized as a global social movement that says sustainable development is important for us and for our future, and no powerful corporate sector in narrow interest can take sustainable development away from all of the public, but be knowledgeable. We have to know the details. We have to have the same closely with the scientific and engineering community to show real solutions, ways to sustainable development. Let me conclude again by saying that this spring and summer, I would like governments around the world to work together with the academic community, the business sector, and civil society to begin national deliberations on the sustainable development goals so that the country becomes sensitized to data, so that young people have a say, so that the public is aware, so that we can turn this into a movement of people around the world say it is important to achieve the sustainable development goals. For participating today, please do, if you have a chance, get a copy of The Age of Sustainable Development ad, because I think book can be helpful in supporting, of course, the course, but also in helping to explain to your friends, family, everybody why it's so crucial, why we do really need the public voice to say sustainable development is the approach to make a decent world economy and a sustainable world economy, and our design be a small step in that direction, that your leadership will be a very, very important step. See you soon. We'll have another Google Hangout within the next few weeks. Thanks a lot.